We're remaking another one of our earliest videos, and today we've got the duel of Seadra and Kingdra. The truly old among us remember when Seadra was a fully evolved Pokemon, and when Misty had its pre-evolution Horsey while we're at it. Before Gen 2 came along and gave the line a new final stage, one we encountered when fighting for the 8th gym badge against Claire, whose Kingdra was infuriatingly difficult for all 3 starters to take on. What enhanced Kingdra's status as an irritating Pokemon was the fact that it only evolved from Kingdra from being traded while holding a dragon scale. So, like many other trade-reliant Pokemon, it remained out of reach for many. Claire also wielded her Kingdra against Ash in the anime, and in the 3rd Pokemon film, Molly Hale created an illusory Kingdra through the unknown, which she used to take on Misty. Ancient lore aside, we've got plenty to burn through today, so let's jump right into that burning question: how great were Seadra and Kingdra actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Seadra's decent speed, special, and defense alongside Water Stab and Blizzard were all solid traits. However, decent though those stats were, they weren't matching the Pokemon in OU or even UU. Plus, its solid defenses were let down by an absolutely paltry base 55 HP, so it wasn't quite as good at taking hits as it liked. It could take a big hit just fine, but generally not repeated hits, which limited its niche. That was fine though, because its stat spread let it fit well into RBYNU, and its niche was not one where it would be tasked with taking repeated hits if it could help it. Its role was to finish proceedings off late game with agility, letting it blast through faster would-be revenge killers with solid strength of its Hydro Pump and Blizzard, helped by its respectable crit rate. It was quite difficult to stop in a late game scenario, especially since agility let it bypass something like Clefable's Thunder Wave in the days before Clefable rose to UU. Between that and Seadra's bulk, dealing with Seadra wasn't easy by virtue of the fact that you didn't just have to withstand one hit and then it'd be done for. Nope, you'd have to hit it repeatedly, which was a tough task when considering the offensive threat it presented while you'd attempt to do so. However effective Seadra was in this role, it was far from the most spammable Pokemon. It offered just about nothing to its team in terms of defensive utility, and one had to exercise great caution when trying to get it on the field, since subjecting it to even lighter hits seriously impeded it thanks to that low HP, let alone the earthquakes coming from the pokes Seadra would like to scare out but couldn't switch into like Nidoking and Golem. This isn't necessarily make or break for a wall breaker, which Seadra could also function as, but considering much of its appeal was the agility late game that let it outrun major targets in Charizard, Mr. Mime, and Electrode, it was generally preferable to keep its health as close to full as possible, more so than your average Pokemon. Thus, it wasn't for every team. Additionally, Seadra seriously struggled with the Staplemon Blastoise and didn't do very well against Kingler either. That said, if these Pokemon were worn down, or better yet, the opponent's water was Kabutops, the effort of preserving Seadra for the late game could be well worth it, as there it could unleash its terrifying potential. And so Seadra had a solid debut overall in Generation 1. Kingdra hit the scene in Gen 2 and was noticed by many players for its effective lack of weaknesses. Its only weak point was Dragon, but Dragon Breath, the only real quote-unquote threat in this regard, was as rare as it was weak. Kingdra would be more concerned with neutral thunders than the so-called super effective hit Nothing Use anyway. Speaking of, the idea of a bulky water type not hit super effectively by thunder was also quite appealing. However, the issue was that Kingdra had plenty of superb competition from other waters, whose upsides outweighed the fact that they were hit super effectively by thunder. Suicune, its most direct point of contention, was far bulkier and had valuable phasing in Roar. Vaporeon's bulk also dwarfed it, and with growth was one of the scariest threats in the tier. Starmie's bulk was not as impressive, but it more than compensated with access to Rapid Spin, as well as recovers reliable healing and a valuable fighting resist. These Pokemon were generally capable of putting some form of pressure on opponents, where Kingdra erred more on the passive side. Once it hit the field, it didn't really do much, and this in fact meant that its electric neutrality didn't really amount to anything too meaningful. It wasn't actually doing anything back to Zapdos or Raikou, and it's not like it was taking these thunders particularly well either. Having said that, Kingdra did find the niche. With its quadruple water resistance, it was excellent at stifling even a max growth boosted Vaporeon, since 999 special attack Surfs bounced off of it. Plus, with its great bulk and electric neutrality, it could act as a pseudo Suicune in terms of answering the ever-irritating Nidoking. At first, it was theorized that Kingdra would be the best with Surf, Haze, Rest, and Sleep Talk, letting it neutralize Vaporeon's growth as well as resetting something like Machamp or Snorlax's curses. However, this was too flawed to see any real use because it was so incredibly passive. Kingdra only able to threaten a Surf that, while not weak, was hardly a metagame crusher. All it took was one change though, none other than Dragon Breath. Kingdra didn't need Haze to stall Vaporeon out, and Dragon Breath, with its hefty 30% paralysis rate, allowed it to actually contribute to the progression of a game state by spreading Paralyze for the benefit of its hard-hitting teammates. This gave Kingdra an incredibly specific, yet legitimately decent niche on certain bulky teams. It was rare as anything, but it was something, and it was certainly better than languishing completely uselessly in BL, as it was far too good for UU. Seadra initially returned to NU in Gen 2, but it wasn't nearly as good this time around. Though taking Rest Talk 2 attack sets seemed appealing at first, it quickly became clear that Seadra was entirely outclassed by competitors Octillery, Dugong, Kingler, and Chinchou, and generally outmatched against tier staples like Xatu, Statler, and Primate. It eventually fell out of NU entirely as the player base abandoned any continued pretense towards its viability. However, since Seadra was no longer a fully evolved Pokemon, it was not a blemish on its record. It took a while for Kingdra to be recognized for his talents in advance, as during the metagame's time as the current generation, offensive threats were valued for their defensive presence as well, since that defensive presence more consistently generated offense in a tier generally characterized by bulk, where damage was accrued across repeated hits over the course of a game. However, when Gen 3 came to be influenced more by the fast-paced offensive playstyles of Gen 4 and 5, the player base realized just how much of an utter terror late-game Kingdra could be. Sure, you had to hold it back until late game, but this wasn't really that much different from preserving a Calm Minder for the same purpose. The Calm Minders had more defensive utility, yes, but they could hardly match the sheer terror Kingdra inspired in opponents when it appeared near the end of a battle. It wasn't just the surprise factor, but the precise ruthlessness of its assault, in that its standard Rain Dance Swift Swim set was both massively powerful and faster than the tier could throw at it. It was utterly lights out against many a standard team, and though it wouldn't become a standard, it quickly established itself as a legitimate threat, one of the best of the late game. Part of what made Kingdra so excellent was its bulk. Not only was it naturally tanky, especially for such a threatening sweeper, it also didn't need any speed EVs to outrun the entire unboosted metagame at +2, so it could freely run max HP and thus find more opportunities to unleash its fury on the opponent. It was excellent at withstanding hits from traditional late game threats like boosted Dragonlance Tyranitar and Salamence, as well as Choice Band Aerodactyl, and turning the tides with the Rain Dance fueled counter sweep. Its rain was particularly tough to stop, since Tyranitar was utterly terrified of its Hydro Pump, and so attempting to cut the rain off was a risky endeavor at best. Tyranitar would often be sacrificed just to try and keep the rain off, but this also wasn't the most reliable since Kingdra could so often Rain Dance in its face. Sometimes Kingdra ran more speed investment though, as this allowed it to be a greater threat immediately, before setting up Rain, outrunning threats like more offensive variants of Tyranitar and Metagross. Being able to blast the opposition apart without needing the turn to boost made it even scarier, and like the leftovers which allowed it to remain at full health even when Sand was active, often crucial for surviving big hits so it could get that all-important Rain Dance off. But it was a superb user of Lumberry as well, letting it set up in the face of Thunderwave's Zapdos for instance, and sometimes it even paired Lum with Substitute, allowing it to get a sub on that second attempted use of status and making it even scarier. If Kingdra got a sub on a switch to a slower Pokemon trying to be sacrificed to allow something else free entry, it was almost surely game over. After Rain Dance, Hydro Pump, and Ice Beam, it had plenty of great options for the last move slot. Hidden Power Grass most commonly, letting it break through Starmie, meaningfully damage offensive Suicune, and making it far more consistent in laying waste to Swampert, though Surf was also a popular alternative, so you didn't have to lose games because you were forced to Hydro Pump a 20% Jirachi and wound up missing. While Kingdra was most commonly used as a cleaner on more traditional kinds of offense teams, both special focus and mixed, it also inspired some more innovative strategies that pushed the tier forward. For example, combining with Swords Dance Heracross. Whereas Kingdra excelled at tearing through offense, Hera thrived against bulkier teams that would give Kingdra trouble. The apex of the inspiration Kingdra brought to the tier though was the development of all-out Rain Dance teams, which would become Kingdra's trademark. They were on the specific side, since full-on Rain was never going to be the most consistent pick in the Tyranitar and Blissey metagame that was advanced, but they were a legitimate choice, and when they hit, they hit. All in all, Kingdra developed into one of the scariest, most perpetually underrated threats in Gen 3 OU. Meanwhile, Seadra returned to NU again, where it was okay. Competition was fierce though. Wailord was one of the best Pokemon, full stop, and Huntail was elite as well. Much scarier than Seadra as a rain dancer, in fact, because it got Swift Swim, whereas Seadra for some reason did not. Even though it wasn't just its evolution Kingdra that got it. It was its pre-evolution Horsea too, while Seadra was saddled with Poison Point. A good ability to be sure, but not really one suited for Seadra's game. However, Seadra was decent because it was much faster naturally than either of these two, which gave it a solid opportunity to fire off attacks. These attacks were hardly shattering the tier, but it was fine enough to form Seadra's unspectacular yet occasionally serviceable niche. It was utterly outclassed, but in the rare event it was used, it would perform decently. It was mostly rare because there weren't that many scenarios where its additional immediate speed would be more useful for a team than Wailord's Self-Destruct or Huntail's Swift Swim. It was a decent partner to those Pokemon though, for teams that wanted to overwhelm opponents through repeated water-type assaults. This tactic was usually seen with both Wailord and Huntail, but Seadra could be used nicely as well. Its high speed helping finish opponents off without needing the setup turn. Kingdra was a new beast in Generation 4, now able to use stab from both sides of the offensive spectrum thanks to the physical special split, meaning it could use its previously useless access to Dragon Dance, and it was now powered up further thanks to new additions in Life Orb, Choice Specs, and meaningful Dragon Stab and Dragon Pulse, buffed Outrage, and of course Draco Meteor. It took Kingdra a while to catch on in OU, as Diamond and Pearl was mostly overwhelmed by a little Pokemon called Garchomp, but once that was banned and Platinum came around, Kingdra came to the forefront in 3 different forms. One, with its Dragon Dance sets as a solid anti-metagame threat capable of cutting through many standard teams during the early days of Shaman Sky and Scarf Heatran. 2, as a part of Dragon Spam teams that emerged in the wake of Salamence receiving Outrage and the unban of Latias. And 3, of course, as a part of Rain teams. Let's get number 3 out of the way first because it's quickest. Kingdra was the rain threat. If you were using rain in OU, a difficult task given the omnipresence of a Tyranitar now brandishing a special defense boost in the sandstorm it whipped up, you were doing so because of Life Orb Kingdra. Yes, it was flanked by other newly terrifying Swiftstormers and Kabutops, Ludicolo, and so on, but Kingdra with its superb mixture of speed, outrunning even Scarf Latias, massive secondary stab, and powerful Hydro Pump was the essence of why rain was worth running at all. Anyway, the Dragon Dance sets were Kingdra's go-to for some time, especially on Kingdra spam Magnezone teams or Drag Mag, where Skarmory would be removed and Kingdra would use its excellent stab combination only resisted by Empoleon, well, and Shedinja, but that wasn't being used, to cut through much of the rest of the metagame. Its quadruple fire resistance was also excellent in warding off Heatran's mighty Fire Blast. Substitute Lumberry was the standard Dragon Dance Kingdra for some time, but eventually a new set popped up. It ran heavy special defense investment, and instead of Sub and Lum, it ran Rest and Chestelberry. It was designed as a counter to beasts many offensive teams struggled to withstand. Life Orb, Starmie, and offensive Suicune that had already gotten a Calm Mind boost. It could take 2 Ice Beams from them, even with Stealth Rock, allowing it to set up multiple Dragon Dances, then rest back to full health, immediately wake up, and be in prime position to deal some heavy damage. This set was especially scary when it had the element of surprise on its side. Its completely unexpected nature, being as offbeat from traditional offensive playstyles as it was, won it many games. However, the set continued being effective even when it became a standard, as it did and was used on many a new wave of standard offense teams. It was now rarely a specialization of Drag Mag or Rain, and more just a standard Pokemon for its incredibly useful utility blended with offense, especially useful in the wake of the Latias and Salamence bans, which eliminated powerful Dragon-type competition. Eventually though, Chestel Rest Kingdra started falling to the wayside as the player base realized just how thoroughly underwhelming its power was. Base 95 attack isn't bad necessarily, but it is when one of your stabs locks in and the other more spammable one is only 80 base power. Gengar gets away with this level of stab power because its special attack is so high. Kingdra did not. Instead, new methods of using Kingdra emerged, specifically the Rain Dance set. No, this wasn't Kingdra on a Rain team. This would be a standard offensive team, except instead of something like Starmie as your offensive water, you would use a Kingdra that set up Rain Dance for its own purposes. Rain teams were famously unreliable, but this Kingdra set was the opposite, needing 1 turn of setup. This was no different from the Dragon Dancer, except unlike the DD variant, this set caused way more immediate destruction, with scarily powerful Hydro Pumps complemented by mighty Draco Meters, and most notably, effortlessly outspeeding the Scarf Flygon that was one of the most popular Pokemon in the game, and with the go-to revenge killing option many teams had for Dragon Dance Kingdra. Many offensive teams were absolutely shredded by Kingdra, scrambling to try and get a Tyranitar in to cut off the rain, which was of course risky. Rain Dance Kingdra was a major reason why Pastoral Berry became so popular on utility tar sets. However though, this Kingdra could clean up with the best of them. It was often used as a mid-game wall breaker, which didn't try to sweep the opposition, just leave as much destruction strewn in its wake as possible, which it did effortlessly even if its move didn't hit the right targets every time simply by virtue of how strong they were. It would then be easy pickings for a teammate like Calm Mind Jirachi to finish things off. Some ran Dual Dance Kingdra with Dragon Dance catching opponents expecting special attacks after the initial Rain Dance off guard, and a DD Kingdra in Rain was massively scary, but generally Special Kingdra was more consistently scary, not least because it didn't need Rain to launch terrifying Hydros and Dracos. With the metagame now reveling in the threat that was Special Kingdra, it was time for the next step, Specs Kingdra. No more Life Orb recoil, no setup turns, just maximizing the immediate brute force of its stabs. It was effectively a replacement for Specs Latias, while Kingdra of course lacked Latias' amazing list of resist and speed. It could match it for power. In fact, Modest Kingdra was slightly stronger than Timid Latias, and in addition to Draco, it was much scarier with the steel scarring water stab, while also of course not fearing Tyranitar's pursuit. This made Kingdra an excellent pick for bulky offense teams looking to threaten popular balances while still retaining a Pokemon valuable against opposing offense, since Kingdra's natural bulk was great for taking hits from even major threats like Dragon Dance Gyarados or Agility Metagross. Even when Latias returned to the tier, Specs Kingdra remained a monstrous threat. After all, Latias was not but another water resist afraid of Draco Meteor. In fact, Specs Kingdra was one of the biggest threats to Latias Clefable defensive teams, since Clefable was deathly afraid of its Hydro Pumps and Surfs, while such teams' water resist was Latias, which, well, risked the KO for trying to pivot into such moves. Specs Kingdra was so good, even Rain teams began using it. Why bother switching moves when you've got Specs Hydro and Rain? All in all, Kingdra was an excellent, important Pokemon in Gen 4 OU. Oh, and that's not all. Kingdra was also a massive threat in Gen 4 Ubers, where it was supported by the permanent reign of Kyogre, whose enormous power also helped set the stage for Kingdra's ruthless cleanup abilities. You might manage to play around the insane power of Specs Kyogre. It's bruised, but at least the Ogre has gone down, and you won't have to deal with it anymore. But now here comes Kingdra, which you can't outspeed with the standard Scarfers Dialga, Palkia, Kyogre, and Garchomp. Unlike Kingdra's similarly threatened cousin Kabutops, Groudon was terrified of switching into Kingdra to replace the Rain with Sun, considering the blistering damage intake in the process. Special offense teams centered around a late-game Kingdra sweep were aplenty, both majorly successful and metagame defining. If you preserved your Kyogre and the opponent didn't have an Airlock Rayquaza waiting, and most Rayquazas were used early game, then Kingdra was absolute death late game, marking a significant role in Gen 4 Ubers. Sadly, Seadra was no longer able to keep up with NU at all with Gen 4's power creep, but again, it was no longer fully evolved, so not a problem. Politoed brought permanent rain to OU, and you know what that means? A legion of Swift Swimmers attack, led by none other than Kingdra. Sure, there were other monstrous rain abusers like Hydration Manaphy, but the Swift Swimmers were the scariest because of their speed, and Kingdra was the scariest of the swimmers. Oh, there's a new Pokemon called Ferrothorn that resists both stabs? Yeah, you mean that Pokemon 3-hit KO'd by Specs Hydro Pump in Rain? Yup. Kingdra's immense threat level, especially when supported by fellow Swift Swimmers, had the player base screaming for a rain ban almost immediately. It was clear that something was off. Instead, Drizzle was famously, or infamously, not banned on its own, but in conjunction with Swift Swim. So in that sense, Kingdra officially defeated OU. It was so crazy under Rain teams themselves weren't allowed to use it. Now though, it was reduced to the occasional use by someone looking to counter Team Rain. It was very rare since as popular as Rain was, one could generally bring measures that were more consistent against other playstyles. If you did bring Specs Kingdra into Rain, you would absolutely terrorize the opponent. You just wouldn't bring Kingdra most of the time. That said, Specs Hidden Power Fire Kingdra had its moments in giving Sand Ferrothorn teams a nasty surprise. Still, despite its almost complete lack of usage after the fact, Kingdra's brief tenure in OU was so destructive, it literally brought into existence a new style of rule, just so Rain didn't have to be banned from OU in its entirety. With power creep and this newfound low usage, Kingdra dropped to UU for the first time. This metagame was so famous for resembling Gen 4 OU, and Kingdra was a major reason why. With its Dragon Dance, Rain Dance, and Specs sets, it was basically the same exact Pokemon as it had been in that metagame, except it was now unbothered by Tyranitar's Sand, and its Dragon Dance set didn't have to fear Skarmory. It regularly squared off with many familiar faces like Swampert, Flygon, Zapdos, and Shaman. Kingdra wasn't just good in this new tier though, it was downright tremendous. Its go-to sets effortlessly smashing through much of the tier. Despite its unspectacular offensive stats, it hit harder enough on both sides of the spectrum, and what made it especially scary was how completely different answers were to physical and special sets. For instance, Snorlax was a good answer to special Kingdra sets, but it got utterly run over by Dragon Dance. Meanwhile, Swampert was an effective deterrent to Dragon Dance Kingdra, but got absolutely deleted by special sets. What made this particularly scary was that it was immensely difficult to tell what kind of Kingdra it was at Team Preview, so you had to play a potentially lethal guessing game, and even if you guessed right, Kingdra was generally strong enough to the point where it'd wind up dealing seriously heavy damage anyway. As such, Kingdra was a fixture on offensive teams, providing them with some of the best wall breaking available, while its quadruple fire resistance also provided a highly important defensive niche, one of the sturdiest answers possible to Victini and Darmanitan's vicious fire stat. To have this on such a great offensive Pokemon, i.e. not having to slow down the fast pace in order to have such a resilient check to them, was just amazing. All in all, Kingdra was one of the most elite Pokemon in Generation 5 UU. Finally, Kingdra retained another solid niche in Ubers. Though it was not as threatening or easy to throw on a team this time around, in addition to Ferrothorn slowing it down, the proliferation of the massively bulky Arceus, while certainly far from immovable, was an obnoxious deterrent to its threat level, and in Black and White 2, the popularity of special defensive Kyogre, which rose to counter Choice Specs Kyurem White, meant that Kingdra was naturally going to be checked by many teams. Additionally, Kingdra now faced more stringent competition from fellow Swift swimmer Kabutops, whose Rapid Spin was highly valuable in this hazard-littered metagame, and who was a superb check to the terrifying Extreme Killer Arceus. That said, Kingdra was of course still a fierce threat on many teams. Notably, none of its issues couldn't be overcome with good play and support from Spikes. Kingdra brought its Swift Swim antics to the weather-infested metagame of VGC, unbothered by any complex bans, and made it especially terrifying because in addition to the usual terror wrought by its stab combination, the boosted water end of that stab was also occupied by spread moves, meaning it was especially apt at dousing opponents before they stood a chance at responding. Surf was all reliable, but if a player didn't mind stomaching the occasional grimace that came with 85% accuracy, they could potentially reap the benefits of bestowing such frustrations on the opponent through the equally powerful Muddy Water and its 30% chance to drop accuracy, meaning if the opponent tanked the hit, they'd have a serious chance of not being able to hit Kingdra in return. Otherwise, its offensive move pool crushed most everything in its path with Draco Meteor and or Dragon Pulse, sometimes running Ice Beam to hit Amoonguss harder, and even Hidden Power Electric, while Protect and Substitute brought utility in being able to unleash its moves more precisely. Arceus helped you if you protected, and Rain fueled Kingdra subbed up. However, it wasn't all raining days and rainbows for Kingdra. Its complete dependence on rain was a limiting factor, and it thus struggled to compete as consistently in a metagame where Garchomp was so effortless to run, especially since sand teams as a whole were generally more consistent. That said, Kingdra certainly had its place and had some excellent appearances. The first ever Canadian national saw Mika Papagiannis run Kingdra en route to a finals appearance. What stopped him from winning? Oh yeah, it was the Muddy Water miss. Ouch. Just kidding, it was actually 2 Muddy Water misses. Yeesh. Still, Kingdra had proved its mettle in the 2012 metagame, especially as Nugget Bridge's leader Scott Glaza rocked it to 10th place at Worlds. Kingdra really hit its stride in 2013 though, and his placements were as follows. Alan aka Dubilis, 8th at Virginia Regionals, Joseph Brumet, 10th at Georgia Regionals, Paul C. and Grace A. 1st and 5th at the U.S. National Senior Division, and Jason Fisher-Short and Zach Jens 8th and 18th in Masters. Marcus L. top 8 German National Senior Division, and Alberto Gini and Matteo Gini 1st and 8th in Masters, both using the same team of Politoed, Kingdra, Scizor, Thundurus, Hydreigon, and Breloom, funnily enough. Gabriel S. top 4, and Mark M. and Morgan H. top 8 at the UK National Senior Division, and Christopher Arthur 16th in Masters. Ben Kilby, Jackson Lakey, and Kane Matthews 1st, 12th, and 15th at Australian Nationals. Maxim C. 2nd, Italian Nationals, Senior Division, and in Masters, Matteo Gini 1st, Matthias Helmut and Jordy P. top 4, Alberto Gini, Javert Burden, and Christopher Arthur top 16, with Matteo and Alberto Gini running the same team once again. So overall, quite a good season of VGC for Kingdra. Rain no longer being permanent meant Kingdra could return to abusing it in OU. The problem was that this strategy was just as consistent as it had been in Generation 4, and unlike that gen, Kingdra was no longer a dangerous poke in its own right. It needed the rain to function. Now it could be very, very scary on occasion, as irritating as it could be to get rain going with the newly frustratingly inept Politoed, now forced to carry Damp Rock. The results could be beautiful when Kingdra got in and deleted offensive teams with some specs Hydro Pump. However, there was just too much going against it for Rain to ever be more than a very rare gimmick team. Sand teams were still popular, So was Mega Charizard Y and its son, and Kingdra's Hydro Pumps had even been knocked down to 110 base power from their previous 120, so they didn't quite sting the same way anymore. If you wanted to occasionally punish offensive teams, sure, Rain could be fun, and as always, there was no such thing as a Rain team without Kingdra. However, if you wanted a consistent Hydro Terror, you'd go with one of the best Pokemon in the game, Keldeo. This time around, Kingdra wasn't nearly as threatening in UU. The prominence and excellence of Empoleon saw to that, if nothing else, but so too did the meta game generally getting faster, stronger, and bulkier. Kingdra's stats generally paled in comparison, and the nerfs to both Draco Meteor and Hydro Pump's power didn't help. It wasn't much of a standalone poke, and Rain teams were gimmicky and unreliable. As such, in ORAS, Kingdra dropped to RU, and there it was utterly hilariously broken. It single-handedly made Rain relevant, more than relevant, dominant. It was a monstrous threat on its own too, whether Dragon Dancing, going solo Rain abuse, or using the buff Focus Energy alongside Scope Lens, and its crit strengthening secondary ability Sniper to automatically crit with each move. Crit Draw, as it was called, was exactly as insane as you'd expect from a Pokemon that crit every Draco Meteor, even with Gen 6 nerfing crit damage. Basically, Kingdra could do anything and it would effortlessly shatter RU. Players were resorting to incredibly specific Pokemon like Shell Armor Escavalier to stop its crit antics, and of course Escavalier was swept away by the tidal wave that was Kingdra's Water Stab, especially in Rain. Players were resorting to Shell Armor Lapras of all things to try and slow it down. Amusingly, there could have been an RU where Kingdra would have been manageable, as the metagame had previously lost both Slowking and Whimsicott, which would have checked it nicely, but it wasn't meant to be, and Kingdra ate a quick ban for its demolition of RU. It wouldn't be repeating its Uber's niche this time around, given the lack of permanent Rain right from XY, and Kyogre not wanting to hold Damp Rock solely to enable a Pokemon that wasn't that strong. The nerfs to its stabs would be really noticeable in Ubers, and then ORAS brought Primal Groudon and the already non-existent niche was really stomped out. However, all things considered, Kingdra still had a decent niche in Generation 6. Despite the challenges brought by Gen 6, like lack of permanent rain, Mega Charizard Wise Sun around every corner, and the nerfs to Kingdra's stab moves, it remained a solid choice in VGC, performing much of the same as it had before. Being able to outspeed and threaten Megas as hard as Kingdra did was excellent, and unlike fellow Rain abuser Ludicolo, it wasn't immediately threatened by Talonflame's priority Brave Bird. Its higher special attack was valuable even when bashing through the likes of Aegislash too. Having said that, Kingdra getting blanked by waters like Azumarill was not great news, so there was give and take for when Ludicolo's stab Giga Drain was more needed. But overall, Kingdra was a useful part of Rain teams. Its viability was more or less tied to how these teams were performing, so it generally had a solid season. Its 2014 placements were as follows: Cameron S first in the senior division, and London S first in the junior division. In the Virginia regionals, the Japanese players YT top 16 at the Tokyo Arena Off, T1 9th place at the Asia Cup, and the first place Asia Cup Korea qualifier. Sapphire Birch aka Mikoto Misaka first at the NYU Grassroots Tournament, Tristan Medine 8th at the Wisconsin Regionals, Drizzle Boy top 8 Virginia and Massachusetts Regionals senior division, and Tommy Kulin 7th in the latter regional masters. Timo Kapech 9th at the German Nationals, Trainer George 5th at the Perth Regionals, Trainer Jackson 10th at the Brisbane Regionals, Kyle Chua 4th at the US National Senior Division, and Jackson Hambrick 35th in Masters. Barris Ockles 24th and Timo Kapech 31st at Worlds. For the 2015 season that began in 2014 and was played under those rules, Kingdra was also used by Lee Camacho, who got 3rd in the Texas Regionals, Augustin Bordel 2nd at the Argentina Premier Challenge, and in 2015 proper, Chris Stotts 4th at the Oregon Regionals, Carson S 1st at the Florida Regionals Senior Division, Jonathan Melendez 4th at the Georgia Regional Senior Division, Bradley Drayton 4th at the Sydney Regionals, Jacob S 3rd at the Australian National Senior Division, Daniel Otstekin 2nd at the UK Regionals, Gabby Snyder 8th at the Washington Regionals, Carlos Rodriguez 20th at the German Nationals, Matthias Helmuth 14th at the Italian Nationals, Luke Smith 5th at the US Nationals Junior Division. But then Kingdra disappeared completely in 2016's Primal Groudon and Mega Rayquaza driven metagame, but it had already racked up another solid season of VGC. Rain received several major buffs in Gen 7, a much improved Rain setter in Pelipper, a Mega Swampert whose Swift Swim kicked in immediately upon Mega Evolving, unlike Gen 6, and excellent new abusers in Ash Greninja and a Z-move wielding Manaphy. Rain burst onto the scene and established itself as a legitimate force, not a gimmick, but a team style whose consistency came close to reflecting its potential power, and as it did, Kingdra was of course used. After all, what's Rain without Kingdra, right? Well, that's the thing. The player base quickly noticed that the team slots for Rain teams were far more competitive competitive now. Kingdra still had enormous potential, of course, able to slice through the tier's many fast offensive teams like butter, but it was no longer peerless in its rain abuse and thus no longer an automatic addition. The other rain abusers used were generally valued higher because in addition to ripping up offense, they could also threaten common defensive Pokemon, not just Ferrothorn, but the ultimate bane of rain, Toxapex, whom Kingdra was quite hapless against. Even Specs Dracos were shrugged off. Thus, as rain became optimized, Kingdra was phased out and standard configurations of rain did not use it. Its upsides were certainly nice, but nothing too good to go without, and was simply too difficult to fit over Mega Swampert, Astra Ninja, Manaphy, Tornadus Therian, Tapu Koko, Magearna, Kartana, and Ferrothorn. If only it were a little stronger. So sadly, instead of rejoicing in Rain's renewed OU viability and glory, Kingdra tumbled through the tiering rung, ever more hapless in the face of power creep. This time it wasn't even sufficient for RU, it landed all the way down in NU. Now some comfort, it may have hit a new low, but it wasn't that low just yet, as it crushed RU before it. Kingdra now sought vengeance through the throttling of its new home, and such vengeance it found through the ruins it left the tier in. It was pretty much standard Kingdra antics in a tier full of Pokemon with stat spreads insufficient to take it on. Seeing as Kingdra had made a career out of beating Pokemon with superior stats, it follows that it absolutely dominated these lower tiers it eventually found itself in. Kingdra's power was bolstered by its unpredictability in running either Dragon Dance or special sets, but even if you knew it was coming, it shredded you through force anyway, especially since its typing and bulk were so robust against most of what the tier wanted to throw at it. As a result, Kingdra found itself in NUBL very quickly. Sadly, that was pretty much it as far as Kingdra's Gen 7 goes. Despite occasional attempts to get Crit Drill working in RU, it wasn't just worth it compared to the far more consistent pokes in the tier. However, this was still a decent gen for Kingdra. A resounding ban from NU isn't bad at all, despite this being overshadowed by the historical landmark that was Kingdra finally not being an automatic inclusion on any OU rain team it was allowed on since it gained Swift Swim. Kingdra was used literally once in Gen 7 VGC, which should tell you all you need to know about how much it was part of the metagame. In 2018, Matias Caricchio rocked it to a 4th place finish at the Chile special event. Well done to him for succeeding in a way literally nobody else did, but yeah, Kingdra was generally outdone in Gen 7's doubles format as well. Kingdra got 2 very significant buffs in Generation 8. Flip Turn, an incredible tool allowing it to maintain momentum even against its enemy Toxapex, and Hurricane, which blended superb anti-grass coverage with solid power. Was this enough to bring it back to OU Rain? Sadly, no. In place of the Mega Swapper that had eclipsed it as a Swift Swimmer previously, now came Barraskewda, boasting Flip Turn not just as a pivot tool, but an offensive weapon in its own right, while hitting the metagames much harder, including potentially running Psychic Fangs for Toxapex. Kingdra's stats really couldn't keep up in comparison. It wasn't much for the lower tiers either, with Drizzle having been banned from UU before Kingdra even joined the game by virtue of Pelipper enabling Dreadnought and Noivern to extreme extents. Kingdra thus wound up languishing in RU rather uneventfully. Then the Crown Tundra dropped, Kingdra returned to NU, alongside Politoed, with Drizzle having been unbanned from UU. Kingdra and Drizzle were immediately banned, as despite power creep, Kingdra in NU was a bit much, shall we say. It drowned pretty much the entire tier, despite the competition from Ninetales' Sun in a mini throwback to Gen 5 OU, as if Raindra wasn't bad enough, it could also focus energy its way past would-be answers like Vaporeon and Gastrodon. This ban didn't last long though, as a major tier shift occurred and Kingdra was returned to the tier without Drizzle, and with the creep of this major tier shift, Rainless Kingdra was no longer the beast it had been previously. It was definitely decent, but no longer a major threat, and struggled to break through new walls like Sylveon and Mantine. As such, Kingdra's dwindling usage saw it drop all the way down to PU, but in an act of blessed mercy and Arceus' grace, Kingdra at least got banned from PU in spectacular fashion for how completely absurd its bulk and power were. It completely smashed staples like Talonflame with whatever set it wanted. Dragon Dance, Rain Dance, Focus Energy, Specs, they were all terrorists which effortlessly switched in and crushed all in its path just as easily. Kingdra actually got banned in a huge wave alongside 9 other Pokemon in DDF, Surfetch, Machamp, Duraludon, Exploud, Alolan Raichu, Sceptile, and Tauros, making the event even grander. One of the terrible PU10, you could call it. So despite having fallen as cruelly far as it had, when it landed, its stats went from being power crept to being a hilarious form of power creep, and it even managed 2 bans from the 2 tiers. Kingdra, much the same still, didn't manage a lot in 2020 VGC, but it had more placements than all of Gen 7. Juan Pablo Nar hit top 4 at the Players Cup 2 Global Finals. Malcolm McKellar reached 13th at the Players Cup 2 Oceania Regional Qualifier. In 2021 though, things took a turn as players began making use of Kingdra's talents more effectively in the restricted metagame. The ability to outspeed and hit Zacian hard simultaneously was especially superb. It was still a far cry from spectacular, but it had a solid niche and thus received a decent uptick in placement, which are as follows: He Zijian and Ren Chengfu 4th and 20th, Winter Series VR Circuit Qualifier number 4, Alec Rubin 13th at the Players Cup 3, Estefan Valdebenito and Stephen Perry tied for 13th at the Players Cup 13th Latin America Qualifier, Alex Gomez VR Circuit Spring Series Qualifier number 5, Manuel Barea and Alistair Gonzalez 12th and 26th, VR Circuit Spring Series Qualifier number 3, Victor Medina 10th at the VR Circuit Spring Series Grand Finale, Sang Huam Cho and Sung Woo Chiang tied for 11th at the Trainers Cup, Darcy McCarthy 1st at the Players Cup 4th Oceania Qualifier, Li Hui Wei 9th at the Asia Players Cup Taiwan Qualifier, and Takehiro Nakata 4th at the VR Series 11 Challenge. Kingdra continued in this occasionally useful vein through 2022, never really making too much of a splash, but sometimes showing up and turning in a devastating performance. It wouldn't be super consistent due to its lack of power relative to what the metagame had become, but it generally worked. Jorge Tordabo 42nd at the Bilbao Special Event and 29th at the Lille Regional, Darsh Patel 37th at the Indianapolis Regional, David R. Monroy and Alessio Fusca 57th and 43rd at the Milan Special Event, Taisuke Konohana and Ryose Nanbu 21st and 26th at the Victory Road and GG Tour February S12 Challenge, Alessio Fusca 6th at the Victory Road and GG Tour Mace S12 Challenge, Kenneth Gamboa 7th at the Victory Road and GG Tour Series 12 Challenge, Benjamin Soul 23rd at the London Open, Taeyong Kim tied for 6th Trainers Cup, Alessandro M 2nd at the Europe International Senior Division. So overall, a nice bounce back of sorts for Kingdra in Gen 8 VGC. Kingdra received Wave Crash in Generation 9, finally allowing it some greater ferocity from the physical side of its water stat. It got an upgrade for its special side too. Now if it wanted to use a 100% accurate move and not risk Hydro Pumps, it would be able to do so while hitting much harder than Surf with its newly gained Weather Ball. Finally, it could also help its power issues with Terrestrialization. Was this enough to bring it back to OU Rain use? Nope, it wasn't just Barraskewda it had to contend with now, but Basque Legion and Floatzel of all things. Telling a Gen 4 player that one day Floatzel would eclipse Kingdra would elicit massive laughs. But yeah, Gen 9 moment. Kingdra could technically find some sort of rain niche not just in OU, but in other tiers as well. With Wave Crash, it could go mixed and Blissey expected to wall a special set would meet a grisly end, but no matter where it went, it'd be outclassed. Barraskewda outdid it in OU, Basque Legion F and RU, Basque Legion and Floatzel in NU. So sure, Kingdra could be used as a supplement to them and do a decent job too, don't get us wrong. It's an okay enough Pokemon. It's just not used very much because as nice as tools like Dracometer and Hurricane are, it just isn't strong enough, and you'd much rather boost a better Pokemon with Terrestrialization. So while you can use Kingdra on rain teams across a variety of times, the reality is you won't. The evidence of this can be found in the fact that Kingdra is used so little. It has fallen even past PU. It is untiered. Yep, Kingdra, former OU star, the Pokemon that rewrote the rulebook, partner of Kyogre, the Pokemon most synonymous with rain abuse, is now untiered. Again, Gen 9 moment. Kingdra has returned to basically not existing in Gen 9 VGC, with the presence of an amazing new Water Dragon and Walking Wake. That's not exactly surprising. Its one placement thus far has been Michael Bashara, 65th at the 2024 Indianapolis Regional. And yeah, there's not really anything more to it than that. And that's it. So how great were Seadra and Kingdra actually? Well, great might be pushing it, but they certainly were good. Seadra's stats were underwhelming for a fully evolved Pokemon, so Game Freak rightfully gave it an evolution, but even still, Seadra managed an NU niche for the first 3 generations. Though the one in GSC was slight and eventually disappeared completely, it was quite decent in the other 2. Meanwhile, Kingdra's been all over the place. It has been used in literally every singles tier. It started in BL or UUBL in its GSC debut, where it had the most specific of OU niches, and retained that tiering status in advance, though there its role in OU was far more pronounced and threatening. It then launched the OU stardom in Generation 4, the same where it partnered up with Kyogre and Ubers. It famously was so busted in Gen 5 OU's permanent reign that an unprecedented complex ban was introduced to prevent it from destroying everything. Its OU presence reduced to once in a blue moon rain counter teams. It dropped to UU, where it pretty much repeated its role from Gen 4 OU en route to becoming one of the tier's most elite Pokemon. It also repeated its solid Ubers niche. Gen Gen 6 was a major drop off. It had sparse use on OU Rain, but it wasn't even UU caliber anymore. Though this resulted in its hilarious destruction of and ban from RU. In Gen 7, even OU Rain had evolved beyond Kingdra, and it fell all the way to NU. Thankfully, it was banned there. It got banned from NU again in Gen 8, but so was Drizzle, and when Kingdra was reintroduced to the meta in a tier shift, it became so overshadowed that it dropped to PU. Fortunately, it got banned there too, but Gen 9 took the direction it'd been going in and really threw it down the elevator shaft, leaving it outclassed in every available tier, and thus making its uses so low as to be untiered. At least it's bludgeoned several lower tiers so as to warrant the ban hammer repeatedly, but really at this point, Kingdra deserves some sort of buff. So overall, Seadra and Kingdra's competitive career were good, but they're starting to feel more than a bit wanting, especially Kingdra. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Kingdra? How would you buff it? Whatever it is, let us know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our platinum tier patrons. Thank you so much to Raven Daytona Ring, Sorazon Croxon, Stoneface Colin, Bingleton, Ray, Daniel Isbeast, Glitcherton, Alex Sabo, Funky, Skylaria, and Jack G for their support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.